20 million barrels. That number moves through a single corridor every day. Not a pipeline, not a canal with locks and gates and scheduled access windows. A strait, open water, 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, narrower than the distance across Greater London, narrower than the distance a commercial aircraft covers in 3 minutes of flight. On any given day, between 15 and 21 million barrels of crude oil pass through this gap. That figure represents approximately 1/5 of all the petroleum traded on Earth. It moves in ships, very large ships, vessels so large that 3 of them placed end to end would stretch the length of Manhattan, each one carrying enough oil to fuel a mid-sized country for a day. They pass through usable shipping lanes that collectively measure less than 4 miles wide. To the north, Iran. To the south, Oman. Between them, the Strait of Hormuz, the exit valve for the Persian Gulf, which holds an estimated 30% of the world's proven oil reserves. Beyond the strait lies the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and access to every ocean on Earth. The ships move in 2 directions, inbound, outbound. There is a system. It has diagrams, it has designated lanes, separation zones, recommended routing. It has been in place in some form since the 1970s. It is also, in the precise legal sense of the word, voluntary. The document that governs the movement of 20 million barrels of crude oil per day through the world's most critical energy corridor is a recommendation, not a treaty, not a law, not an enforceable mandate backed by any authority with the power to compel compliance. A recommendation. That is where this story begins. Pull up the vessel tracking data and the picture looks orderly. On any given morning, Marine Traffic, the open-source ship tracking platform that aggregates automatic identification system transponder data from vessels worldwide, shows the Strait of Hormuz as one of the densest corridors on Earth. Hundreds of vessels in transit. Tankers, gas carriers, container ships, bulk carriers. They appear as small icons moving in 2 roughly parallel streams, northeast to southwest and southwest to northeast, tracing a path through the water that looks, from above, almost methodical. The International Maritime Organization Traffic Separation Scheme diagram makes the system look even more deliberate. 2 inbound lanes, 2 outbound lanes, a buffer zone between them. Precise measurements. Clean lines, the kind of diagram that suggests engineered control, the visual language of infrastructure. And in many ways, the system does function. Ships arrive on schedule, cargo is delivered. The supertankers, very large crude carriers, carry up to 2 million barrels each and move through the strait on a cadence that, when visualized, resembles something between a convoy and an assembly line. These are vessels built in South Korean and Chinese shipyards, operated under flags of convenience from Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, crewed by Filipino, Indian, and Indonesian seafarers, carrying crude extracted from Saudi, Kuwaiti, Iraqi, and Emirati fields, bound for refineries in China, Japan, South Korea, and India. The system is genuinely global. It involves dozens of nations, hundreds of companies, thousands of individual vessels per year. The lanes themselves were not designed for the vessels currently using them. The traffic separation scheme was first formalized through the International Maritime Organization in the 1970s, before the era of the modern very large crude carrier supertanker, before liquefied natural gas carriers, before the volume of daily throughput reached its current levels. The physical geometry of the scheme has not meaningfully changed. The size and volume of the traffic passing through it has. The surface picture, then, is this: a densely trafficked corridor operating on a scheme decades old, with a traffic profile the scheme was not originally designed to handle, moving cargo whose combined daily market value runs into the tens of billions of dollars. It functions. It has functioned, with interruptions, for decades. The question that the surface picture does not answer, the question the vessel tracking maps and the diagrams cannot answer, is a simpler one. What, exactly, is holding this in place? The answer is not what most people assume. It is not a fleet. It is not a treaty. It is not a physical barrier or a monitoring system or an international authority with the power to compel compliance. The Strait of Hormuz remains open because the actors who use it have, so far, each independently calculated that keeping it open serves their interests better than closing it. That calculation is not guaranteed by law. It is not enforced by any institution. It is simply, so far, the math that everyone has arrived at. This is the mechanism the surface picture conceals. The International Maritime Organization Traffic Separation Scheme is a coordination framework. Ships are directed to use it. The language in the governing documents is precise about what that direction means. It is guidance, not compulsion. The International Maritime Organization is a United Nations specialized agency. It sets standards. It recommends practices. It does not operate a coast guard. It does not have the authority to detain a vessel, redirect a ship, or sanction a flag state for non-compliance in real time. The legal foundation underneath the scheme is the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Article 38 of that convention establishes the right of transit passage through international straits. Ships have the right to pass. States bordering the strait are obligated not to impede that passage. This sounds robust. In practice, it contains a structural gap. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is a multilateral treaty. Its obligations bind its signatories. The United States, notably, has not ratified it. More consequentially, for the geometry of the strait itself, the legal obligations of the two states whose territorial waters the lanes actually pass through, Iran and Oman, are not symmetric. Iran contests certain interpretations of transit passage rights in its territorial waters. That contestation is not resolved. It is managed. There is a difference. What fills the gap between the legal framework and the daily reality of 20 million barrels in transit is something more pragmatic. A behavioral norm sustained by commercial pressure. Shipping companies carry insurance. Insurance requires compliance with recognized routing schemes. Deviation from the traffic separation scheme raises premiums. Major charterers, the oil companies and trading houses that book the ships, require vessels to follow established routing for liability reasons. Port state authorities at destination ports track compliance records. The norm is enforced not by governments or treaties, but by the interlocking commercial interests of insurers, charterers, and port operators. The International Maritime Organization scheme is, in practical terms, a coordination mechanism, not a control system. It works the way a handshake agreement works, reliably, when all parties benefit from reliability, and not always when they don't. The stability of the Strait of Hormuz is therefore not a product of architecture. There are no locks. There is no gate. There is no authority that can, in real time, compel a vessel or a state to comply with the lane geometry. What exists is an equilibrium, maintained continuously, by actors whose interests currently align with maintaining it. That is not the same thing as security. It is a different thing, wearing security's face. Set aside the legal question for a moment. Look only at the geometry. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, measures approximately 21 nautical miles across. That is the total width. The usable navigation channel, accounting for shallow water, islands, and the exclusion zones around them, is considerably smaller. The International Maritime Organization Traffic Separation Scheme allocates 2 inbound lanes and 2 outbound lanes, each approximately 2 nautical miles wide, separated by a 2 nautical mile buffer zone. 4 miles of usable lane for 20 million barrels per day. A very large crude carrier is approximately 330 meters long and 60 meters wide. In a 2 nautical mile lane, that vessel has a theoretical lateral margin of roughly 3 kilometers on each side. That number sounds generous until you account for what else is in the lane. On peak traffic days, the strait handles in the range of 20 to 25 large vessels in transit simultaneously across both directions. The separation between vessels is measured not in kilometers, but in hundreds of meters. At loaded draft, when a very large crude carrier is carrying its full cargo, stopping distance can exceed 3 kilometers. These are not abstract engineering parameters. They are the operating conditions inside which a supertanker captain makes navigational decisions at 2 in the morning. In 2019, a series of tanker incidents in and near the strait provided what might be described as an unplanned systems stress test. Several vessels sustained damage in circumstances that remain, in some cases, officially disputed. The incidents were reported primarily as geopolitical events. What they also revealed, less reported, more structurally significant, was how little operational margin the system contains. When uncertainty entered the strait, insurance rates spiked within hours. Several major shipping companies rerouted vessels. Tanker spot rates, the cost of chartering a ship for a single voyage, increased sharply as available capacity contracted. The physical strait remained open. The operational system it supports contracted rapidly and measurably, in response to risk signals that did not include an actual closure. The gap between "the strait is open" and "the strait is functioning normally" is larger than it appears. No engineer designing a critical infrastructure system from scratch, a bridge, a pipeline, a power grid, would route 20% of globally traded petroleum through a single 4-mile-wide corridor with no backup route, no enforcement authority, and operational margins measured in hundreds of meters. That system exists. It moves the equivalent of the entire United States' daily oil consumption twice over, every single day, through a passage that geography made and that no one in the intervening decades has fundamentally changed. The question of why no one has fundamentally changed it belongs in a different segment. First, consider what happens when it moves. There is a persistent and understandable misconception about who Hormuz affects. The intuitive answer is the countries that buy Gulf oil: China, Japan, South Korea, India, the large Asian economies that collectively absorb most of the crude that transits the strait. If the strait closes, they pay. Everyone else watches. This is not how commodity markets work.
Oil is a globally traded commodity.
It is fungible. A barrel of crude from the Persian Gulf and a barrel from the North Sea are not identical, but they are close enough substitutes that their prices move together. Oil is priced on margin, meaning that the price of every barrel on Earth is set not by the average transaction, but by the most expensive transaction needed to clear the market. A disruption in the Strait of Hormuz reduces the physical supply available to Asian buyers. Those buyers do not stop needing oil. They bid for supply from alternative sources: West African crude, North Sea crude, United States shale exports, Canadian oil sands. That increased demand raises the price of those alternative supplies, which raises the global benchmark price, which reprices every barrel being sold anywhere. The transmission mechanism operates through futures markets. It is fast. Price signals propagate within 72 hours of a credible supply disruption signal, not weeks. Not after cargo fails to arrive. Within 72 hours of the market pricing in the probability that cargo might not arrive. The consequence does not stop at crude oil. Petroleum is the feedstock for petrochemicals, the base materials from which plastics, synthetic fertilizers, pharmaceutical ingredients, synthetic textiles, and packaging materials are derived. These supply chains are global and deeply interconnected. A sustained increase in crude oil prices flows through into the production cost of polyethylene, the most common plastic, into the production cost of ammonia, the basis of nitrogen fertilizer, into the cost of active pharmaceutical ingredients manufactured in India and sold globally as generic medications, the price of food packaging in Germany, the cost of fertilizer applied to Brazilian soybean fields, the retail price of generic antibiotics in Southeast Asian pharmacies, These are not metaphors for interconnection. They are the actual transmission pathways through which a geometry problem in the Arabian Sea becomes a line item in a household budget on a different continent. Hormuz is not a regional energy problem. It is a global pricing mechanism. It happens to have a 21-mile physical address. There are two serious arguments about the strait's stability. They are not reconcilable. Both have substantial evidence behind them. The first argument: the equilibrium is more durable than it appears. Every actor with the capability to disrupt the strait is also an actor with significant economic exposure to the consequences of disruption. The states that border the strait, including those that have historically signaled willingness to escalate, export through it. Their revenues depend on it. Closure is not a cost-free instrument of pressure. It is, in economic terms, a weapon that detonates at both ends. One reading of the historical record supports this. The strait has remained operationally open through multiple decades of regional conflict, proxy warfare, sanctions regimes, and direct military confrontation in the surrounding area. Its resilience, on this reading, is not accidental. It reflects the structural reality that disruption is genuinely self-defeating for every actor with the capability to execute it. The second argument: the equilibrium is more fragile than the historical record suggests. It rests on a foundational assumption that the actors capable of disruption are rational maximizers of long-term economic self-interest. Historical behavior, across many actors and many contexts, does not consistently support that assumption. Economic rationality is one input into strategic decision-making. It is not always the dominant one. The equilibrium also assumes that the cost-benefit calculation of disruption remains stable over time. There is no structural reason why it should. Shifts in energy markets, alternative revenue streams, domestic political pressures, and changes in the relative cost of absorbing economic damage can all alter the calculus without any visible signal in advance. There is a third actor in this system whose behavior receives less attention than it deserves: the insurance market. The Lloyd's Joint War Committee maintains a list of areas where war risk premiums apply to marine insurance. The Strait of Hormuz has appeared on versions of that list. When it does, the cost of insuring a vessel in transit increases, in some cases, dramatically. A single committee meeting in London, operating on actuarial models and risk assessments, can effectively price commercial shipping out of the strait without any government decision, without any military action, without a single shot fired. This is not a theoretical scenario. It has happened. The insurance market is a parallel governance layer, one that responds to its own signals, moves at its own speed, and answers to its own logic. The strait is open today. Whether it will remain open tomorrow is not, fundamentally, a military question. It is a question about the stability of an agreement that was never formally made, and about whether the conditions that make that agreement rational for all parties will persist. That question does not have an answer available in the current data. It has a direction of travel, and that is not the same thing. The backup systems exist. That is worth acknowledging. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, the Petroline, runs 1,200 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula from the eastern province to the Red Sea terminal at Yanbu. It has a capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. The United Arab Emirates constructed a pipeline from Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the strait entirely, with a capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day. Combined, under optimal operating conditions, these systems could theoretically move in the range of 6 to 7 million barrels per day around the strait, a figure that has never been consistently achieved in practice. The strait currently moves between 15 and 21 million barrels per day. The gap is not a secret. It is not disputed. The bypass infrastructure has existed for decades. Neither system has been expanded to anything approaching the theoretical maximum that the physical pipeline routes could support. The investment required to close the gap, to build genuine redundancy into the world's most critical energy corridor, has not been made. This is the architectural observation the data supports. Redundancy is an engineering principle applied universally to critical systems. Power grids have backup generation. Aviation has redundant hydraulics, redundant electronics, redundant navigation systems. Hospital operating theaters have backup power supplies that activate in milliseconds. The engineering logic is consistent. The cost of building redundancy is always lower than the cost of the failure it prevents. The Strait of Hormuz has no equivalent redundancy. The bypass systems that exist cover, on generous estimates, perhaps 40% of normal throughput. They have not been expanded. That decision, or the absence of a decision, has been made continuously, year after year, by the states, companies, and institutions that manage the global energy system. The absence of redundancy is itself a policy position. Not a stated one, but a real one, visible in the infrastructure that has not been built. Every year the bypass systems remain underbuilt is a year the world implicitly rebets that the voluntary agreement will hold, that the equilibrium will remain stable, that the calculation every actor makes about the cost of disruption will continue to produce the same answer. That bet has paid off. The question, the one this video cannot answer and will not pretend to, is whether, so far, constitutes a risk management strategy, or whether it is simply what the absence of one looks like.